Hello everybody and welcome to the Cadlam Cymru revision sessions. The session this evening will focus on A-level history and will be presented by Karen Thomas from e-sgol Tudur. The session will last around 45 minutes where Karen will run through relevant content. If you have any questions during the session, please use the question and answer section and we'll do our best to answer your questions. You'll see that there's a hyperlink in the Q&A section. If you're happy to leave your name and address, or email address, sorry, we would love to keep in touch with you so that we can send you information about any future events. You can click on the link at any time during the session. Today's session will be recorded and the recording and any relevant resources will be uploaded to the e-sgol website under Cadlam Cymru. Thank you, Karen. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Welcome to tonight's History A2 Unit 4 Question 1 session. I'm Karen Thomas and I'll be delivering the first two sessions in this block, and then Mr. Andrew Morrell will be answering and doing the third and fourth in this block of sessions. So tonight's session, what I'm going to be doing tonight is giving you first of all an overview of the whole A2 course. It's really important that you know what's ahead of you. Hopefully you've got a good idea already. Today's session is going to focus on Unit 4 Question 1. Now this is the source question. So the first thing I'm going to do is to look at the exam feedback, what the examiners had to say about Question 1 from the Summer 22 series. Obviously we went back to exams last year, so the first thing that as teachers and lecturers do is have a look to see what the examiner is saying about last year's results so that we can obviously guide you the best way we can for the future exams. So we will have a look at that and see what they say about last year's candidates. I will also be going through the WJAC expectations. I'll be looking at the mark scheme, which has slightly changed, and looking at band 6, which is the highest band that you should be aiming for in your exams. I will also be looking at the layout and style of the question. I'll be giving you a source checklist that you can use and reuse for your source analysis. I'll also be giving you some useful sentence starters that you can use and develop as you source evaluate. And also I'll be giving you some general top tips for Question 1. So what I'm hoping to do this evening is to refresh your current source skills from Year 12, but also give you some new ideas, hopefully, as well. So let's begin with an overview of the A-level history course. So in Year 13, you actually complete 3 units. You do Unit 3, 4 and 5. So Unit 3 is what we call your breadth study. So the actual unit is split into a section A, where you choose 1 essay from 2, and a section B, which is your must answer essay question. Now the exam for the breadth study is 1 hour and 45 minutes. So Unit 4 is your depth study, and this is what I'm going to be explaining today and in next week's session. So your Question 1 is the compulsory source question, and your Question 2 is the choice of essay from 2. And it's exactly the same as your breadth study. Your exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes. Now your Unit 5 is actually your non-examined assessment. So that is your controlled assessment that you've probably been doing or at least started in your schools or colleges at the moment. So 60% of this A-level course is actually covered in Year 13. So it's really, really important that you put 110% into these exams this year. Now the breadth study, as I said earlier, is going to be delivered by Mr. Andrew Morrell, and that will be on the Thursday, the 9th of February and the 16th at the same time as tonight's session. And then I'm going to be doing Question 1 today, which is the compulsory source question. And next week I will be doing the essay skills at the same time again. Now then, A-level history. This presentation this evening is going to take me about 40 minutes, and if you have any questions, you can submit them using the chat function or the Q&A section, and I'll go over as many as I can. I will probably stop around about halfway through and ask Andrew if any have come in, and then I'll complete and carry on to the end of the presentation, and then I'll check at the end to see if any more have come in by the end of the session, the last 5 minutes. So we are quite clear now on how Unit 4 is split up with your Question 1 and your choice of essay for Question 2 or Question 3. All of it, of course, lead into that 1 hour 45 exam this summer. Now there are 8 depth study topic areas that your school or your college could be choosing for you to study. So I'm going to run through the 8, and hopefully as I'm running through you will recognise which depth study topic you actually do. Now, because it's a depth study, it means that the time frame is going to be quite narrow, okay, in this actual unit, because they want you to know the information inside and out. So number 1 is the mid-Tudor crisis in Wales and England, 1529 to 1570. So the part 1 is split, so it's problems, threats and challenges. That goes from 1529 to 1553. The part 2 is what you actually do in year 13. So part 1 is year 12 and part 2 is year 13. And the year 13 for topic 1 is challenges facing Mary and Elizabeth. And then that time frame takes you right up to the end of the main time frame that you've got at the top. And this is the same for all of the different topic areas in the depth study. Okay, you may be doing royalty, rebellion and republic, and you will be doing in year 13 the Civil War, Commonwealth and Protectorate. Depth study 3 is reform and protest in Wales and England, and protest campaigns for social reform is what you would do in part 2. Politics and society in Wales and England, and you would do economic social challenges in Wales if you do depth study 4. And you would do that part 2, as I said, in year 13. Number 5 is the religious reformation in Europe, and part 2 is the spread of Protestantism and Counter-Reformation. Number 6 is France and Revolution, and that is France, the Republic and Napoleon. Number 7 is the crisis of the American Republic, 1840 to 1877, with the part 2 being Civil War and Reconstruction. And the Germany one is number 8, which is Germany, Democracy and Dictatorship, with year 13 work being Nazi Germany, 33 to 45. Now, in my presentation this evening, I've got examples from lots of the different topic areas to show you. By far, most schools and colleges do study number 8, which is Germany, Democracy and Dictatorship. But as I say, I've taken examples from across the different ranges of depth studies that you've got an example from each one. Now, because it is a depth study, you need to look at the correct specification for your depth study so that you know exactly what you need to know for the exam. So you need to make sure you know and understand each key issue and the content in the specification. Now, you find all the specifications for those 8 topics on the WJEC site, and I put a link in here so that you can access it straight through to that particular page. And then you can find which topic area you study and your specification will be there. Now, I've got some examples here for you to see. So this is the depth study, and you can see you've got concepts and perspectives, and you've got key issue and content, and you've got all that information there in the middle is what you need to know. Now, obviously, we're at the start, well, we're not at the start, we're in the middle of year 13 course at the moment, so you may not have covered everything in your specification yet, but you should know where you have got to, so you can see how much more of the course is left to study. And it's laid out like this for every depth study. So this is an example from depth study 3. So this is the reform protest in Wales and England, and you can see the same design. You've got concepts and perspectives, and you've got key issue and content on your right. So every single thing on that right hand side you would need to know about, and need to know about it in quite in-depth knowledge. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we'd be looking at the examiner's feedback for question 1, and this is really, really important that we understand what they want us to do for this year. So the first thing they said in their examination overview was that number 1, grade boundaries change yearly. We're all sort of aware of that, and probably most students are. So that basically means what makes an A star and an A or a B. Those grade boundaries change year by year. Okay, so if, for example, an A star was sort of, 30 or 28 out of 31 year, it might drop a bit further for certain years. That changes year on year. There was a slightly new layout to the paper in 2022, and they felt that the candidates coped well with it. So they're going to run this new layout of paper again for you this year. And I will go through those little changes that you need to be aware of for this year in a bit. Number 3, candidates need depth of knowledge, well-honed source skills, and the ability to answer the set questions clearly and directly. So again, that takes you back to knowing your specification. Okay, you need to know it inside and out. You need to have your source skills there and the ability to answer that question as clearly and directly as you can. And that leads into their point number 4, which is you need to focus on the set question, which is how worthy are these sources to an historian in a particular inquiry, which is in your exam question. Number 5, they felt that candidates should try and address sources collectively rather than follow a formula. Now, what that means is they don't want you to statically analyse the sources in an order. Okay, they want you to be able to write freely, obviously cover everything, but have that writing flowing through and talk about the sources in a free way rather than follow a static formula. Number 6 is where sources are addressed. These can tend to be summaries of the content, accompanied by assertions that lack any real justification. So what they want to see from you is certain facts, real justifications in your writing. Okay, now as we go through the rest of the PowerPoint, these will become clearer to you in what you need to do to obviously hit these targets of what they want the candidates this year to be able to do. Now the mark scheme is here as well. Okay, this is a slightly clearer mark scheme than they used to use before. So what we've got are 3 sections. Okay, you've got the value of the sources, you've got analysis and evaluation of the sources in their historical context, and focus on the question set. And you've got bands running down the side. Now I'm going to focus really on band 6 in this presentation, but all the other bands are there for you to have a little look at. I will be comparing it to band 5 so you can see the difference and what you have to put in to get that band 6. Okay, so if we start with the value of the sources first, this first column, to get the top band, the learner shows clear understanding of the strengths and limitations of the source. So that word clear is obviously there, and it wants you to be aware that your writing has to be not just detailed, but clear in where you're going with these sources and source analysis. So the strengths and limitations are clearly there. For the band 5, sorry, if we just compare, the learner considers the strengths and limitations of the sources. So we've got strengths and limitations there, but you're considering it, okay? Whereas up here, there is clear understanding and it is there, detailed and clear for everybody to see. So, you know, there is a difference between these 2 bands, and if you can try and make your work, your value of the sources clearer, then obviously you would get into that band 6. With the middle column, which is looking at the analysis and evaluation of the sources in their historical context, to get that band 6, it tells you that you have to clearly analyse and evaluate in the specific and wider historical context. So they want you to analyse the sources with what's going on directly at that time, but also what is going on in that bigger picture as well. Now, the band 5 description is that there is some analysis and evaluation of the sources in the specific and wider historical context. So it's not all being written about, but if it is all written about clearly, you will hit that band 6 there. The final column for the mark scheme is, are you focusing on the question set? So for band 6, the learner will make a sustained and developed attempt to utilise the sources to directly answer the question set. So in other words, you're using the sources and you are answering the question they're asking you. Clearly, it's sustained and it's being developed all the way through. For band 5, it says that the learner deploys the sources appropriately to support the judgment reached about the question set. So you're doing it and you're doing it appropriately, but obviously the difference is that it's sustained and it's developed in that top band. Now, it's worth keeping this in mind when you do your own source evaluation so that you can check over, have I done this? Have I done the middle section? Have I focused on the question set? So the source question then. I mentioned earlier from the examiner's report that there were little changes to the question last year, and this will be the same for your exam in this summer. So the questions 2019 and previous to that would say, with reference to the question, with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, and assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying, and they would then obviously put the topic area in, and it would be worth 30 marks. Now, last year, and this would be the same for you in this coming summer, they have got rid of the with reference to the sources and instead they have put the word using. So they've made that question shorter. It still wants the same answer, but it goes straight into using your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these three sources to an historian studying. So the end of the question hasn't changed, the marks hasn't changed, it is just that beginning bit which has been taken out and then the word using popped in. Okay. Now you might be wondering why I'm telling you this, and it's because if you wanted to do a past paper, you might look at a past paper and think, oh, that's not the way I'm supposed to do it, so it's not laid out the way I'm familiar with, and therefore I won't attempt it because, you know, it's not going to be the same answer, but it actually is, and I'm going to show you that in a second. So with Depth Study 1, okay, this is an example from last year, 2022. You've got your question here at the start. This is what it's going to look like for you. And then you have your source A with your attribution at the top, your source, and then it'll feed on to source B, the attribution, the source. And then on the other side of the paper, you've got source C, the attribution and the source. OK, and then right at the end there, what we're going to look at next week is your essay. OK, your essay question 2 or 3, you decide which one you want to use. So this is Depth Study 1. And as you can see from 2022, this is Depth Study 8, and it's laid out exactly the same. OK, so all of the topic areas will look like this coming summer. OK, with your question there, the attribution on top of the sources. Now, if we compare it to 2019, this is how it used to look. OK, so you would go straight into your source and the attribution underneath. OK, the source would be in a box, as you can clearly see, and then your question is there at the end. Now, just because there's this difference in the slight layout of the paper, and just because that question has slightly changed, it doesn't mean you can't use past papers on the WGEC site. Quite the opposite. Please do. OK, all you need to do is to change that beginning of the question and be aware that you know it's changed to using, and that you know in your exam it'll come over at the start, and then you'd have the attribution above each of the sources that you have for your exams. So this is from Unit 4 2019, and this is from Depth Study 6 2019. So they can still be used. Don't worry about that. So we've now made it clear how the stems of the questions are going to work for you. This is your stem for this year. We've got the Depth Study 8 question there and the Depth Study 1, and those stems will not change for you. OK, that will be the start of the question at the start of the paper for you. Remember what I said, that can, with the old style papers, you can still use them. You just change that little start and put using your understanding instead, and you can still use those past papers to practice. Now, the essay question we will look at next lesson, OK, next session. But you can see there wasn't much difference, was there, OK, in how they are set out. You've just got the question 2 or 3 in boxes, as opposed to the question 2 or 3 without the boxes around them as they were pre-2022. OK, but I'll do more information on that in next week's session. So, source skills. OK, when we talk about source skills, there are a number of things we should be doing. OK, so all 3 sources will be primary or contemporary from the time, and you should use about 15 minutes to evaluate the sources and about 45 minutes to write up your response. So a little warning with this, official terminology from the WJC, they suggest that you will need to consider the strengths and limitations of the provided sources within the context of the specific key issue rather than the depth study as a whole. So what exactly does that mean? OK, well, what they're basically saying is they want you to look at the strengths of the sources, their limitations with regards to the question that they're asking you, OK, rather than the whole depth study. You've really got to pick up what the question is that they're asking you to do, and also pick up the dates that they're asking you to focus on. OK, now this is the checklist. You would need to do all of these things to do a really good source analysis. OK, so this PowerPoint tonight will be on the e-sgol website, so you can download it at a later time. You can obviously freeze it and take some time over some of these slides. And obviously with a slide like this, you would want to take time to look over it and to learn parts of it possibly. OK, so you will be able to do that later on. Back to the mark scheme again. Remember what the examiner is looking for. Have you addressed the value of the sources? Have you analysed and evaluated them in their context? And have you focused on that question set clearly? And have you sustained a judgment right the way through? So this is the Nazi Germany question from last year. Okay, so this is from topic 8, and you've got your source A there, you've got your question on top, then you've got your attribution and the source. This is your source B, and this is your source C. So remember what I said, that this is being recorded this evening as well. So again, you can go back on and play the recording and pause it at different points. And what I suggest you do is, once we've gone through the whole how to source analysis, you have a go at doing this particular past paper. Okay, this is the one from 2022. If you are unit 8, then obviously this will apply to you. You can have a go at doing those sources, analyse them, see what you would have put down. And then I've also included the examiner feedback for each source. You can compare and think, did I say that? Did I include that? Did I do that? Okay, and that is there for source A, B and C. But for today's purposes, I thought it would be useful for you to see that, yes, you can still use those past paper questions that are there just by amending that question slightly. OK, so I'm going to look at in detail 2019 paper, which is Depth Study 8 paper. Now, before I go on to that, I'm just going to ask Andrew if any questions have come in whilst I've been doing the first half of the PowerPoint.
Hi, Karen. Yeah, one question has come through. With this exam, and you're referring to sources, does that also refer to sources made after the time?
Right, yes. No, it doesn't. OK, this paper will only deal with primary sources and contemporary sources from the time. So, yeah, very good question. But yes, they won't include secondary sources of any kind for this question. It will only be primary contemporary. OK, if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and obviously I can refer to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Andrew. OK, so let's have a look at this then. So we are looking at what this question is focusing on. OK, and what I tell all my students to do is to highlight and underline that exam paper. Make as many notes as you possibly can, so that you know when it comes to writing up where you need to go and what points you need to put into your answer. So this particular question, we know the stem of the question, but it is focusing on the change in treatment of Jews in Germany between 33 and 43. So we've got our topic there, our specific key issue. It's all about the Jews and how their treatment had changed. And we've got our time frame. So the examiner wants to know what changed in the treatment of Jews between 33 and 43. So if it makes it easier for you to remember what you're focusing on, remember to highlight these in the question. So we have now identified that key issue. OK, it is in the question. We know what we're aiming for. So we've got another official terminology alert here. OK, you need to debate and offer judgment on the value of the sources to an historian studying a specific issue, with a focus on discussing the content, provenance and tone of the source, as well as the context in which it was produced. So there's a lot of things that we need to do there, but how would we do it and what exactly does this all mean? So basically, you need to give a judgment. OK, you need to be talking about what you think the value of the sources are. You need to look at the content, what is being said. You need to look at the provenance, where it comes from, what's going on at the time, the tone of the source, how it's been written, and then what the immediate context is, and also the bigger picture of what's going on. So we again would highlight and underline the relevant information in the attribution next of each source, because this would help us to put the source into context before we actually read the source. And obviously the good thing with your exam is that you're not going to be tempted to read the source, because obviously the attribution comes above it for you. OK, so this is obviously 2019, so this would come underneath. So this is from an article in Volkische Beobachter, which is obviously a Nazi daily newspaper in March 1933. So right at the start of the time frame that we are looking at. I also have written the key question alongside the source there to remind me that this is what I'm focusing on. Nothing else. I'm looking at the change in treatment of Jews in the time frame that I've been asked to look at. Source B. This is the American Council in Leipzig writing a report to the American government following the events of Kristallnacht in November 1938. So I can see now that in the chronology of events, we moved along a little bit. We're talking about what's happened after Kristallnacht, and obviously there's a lot that's happened there, and we will analyse the source to be able to do that in a second. And finally, source C is Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, in a speech to SS leaders at Poisson in October 1943. Now, it's up to you if you look at the attribution of each source. I'm a bit nosy. I like to do that before I read the actual sources, or whether you read the attribution and then read that source, okay, and analyse and make notes step by step. It is up to you how you want to do it, okay, but I do it looking at each source and looking at the same thing in each source and moving along in that sense, okay, but you can do it either way as long as everything on that checklist has been explained and mentioned in your answer. Then it doesn't matter which order you do the analysis in. Now, this is Depth Study 2, again, 2019. So it's showing you the old style, but still, you can still use these past paper questions, okay? So you've got the question, the main specific issue has been highlighted as well as the time frame. And then obviously the attribution information that's of importance has also been highlighted. So I know where each of these sources are coming from. So provenance of the source, looking at maybe the background or thinking about the background as you're looking at the attribution, thinking about the origin, thinking about the purpose, that will all come in that attribution section. So we need to look at content, okay, and that is what are the main points are the sources making. Now, again, you can slow this down and obviously have a good look to see whether you'd agree with me with what I've highlighted here. You are looking at the main points of the sources that you might want to develop or mention, okay, or things that you want to remember, okay. So I have done that and highlighted that in source A. I've done the same for source B. Again, obviously, you pause this PowerPoint if you rewatch it, because you can obviously take time to do this properly. And this is source C. Looking at the content, reading what it says, how it's saying it is obviously important as well. That fits into the tone, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we have got a look on your content that has been done. OK, so the date has come under the attribution, the authorship has come under the attribution, the audience, we know who has been written for or said to. The form is there in the attribution. Is it a letter? Is it a diary? OK, all that information is there that we can use. We've obviously looked at the content, so we've looked at the language being used and obviously thought about what sort of additional information on the topic could also be brought in. Now, when we're looking at additional knowledge on the topic, there is a need for obviously appropriate reference to the context, but it needs to be linked to the sources. So what that means is there's no point saying something about something that's completely out of context. OK, that's not in that question. It might be correct, but if it doesn't fit in with the question that it's asking you to explain, then you won't get any marks for it. OK, it is only context of the question that you will get marks for. So be careful, we need additional information, obviously we do, but it's got to link in to the question that has been asked of you to do. OK, so important to know things. I'm not going to read the black section there, that has come out of the WJC, but in pupil-friendly terms, what they're saying is skills and knowledge from Unit 2 question 1 can be used in this question if it's appropriate and relevant. So Unit 2 was your Year 12 work. OK, which was the topic, the first part in what I showed you right at the very beginning. So if you're making a point and you think, oh yes, I could have mentioned that from Year 12 and it is of relevance, then you can bring it in. OK, they will allow you to bring in relevant Year 12 work if it is of use and if it's appropriate and relevant. OK, so back to the source analysis. So what is the tone of the source? OK, obviously when we have the attribution, we kind of get an idea of what we're going to be reading about in the source a lot of the time anyway. The tone of source A is actually obviously in the newspaper right at the very beginning. So the Nazis are trying to unite everyone at this point against the Jewish minority, trying to bring everyone together to have the same mindset as them. Source B is the American point of view. OK, so the tone here is one of anger and despair at how the German state is actually encouraging violence and encouraging German people to condemn the Jews. And source C is quite self-congratulatory. It's absolving the Germans of any guilt with what has happened to the Jews. So we would treat this obviously with caution because it is going to be highly biased, as we know from the attribution. So tone has been, we've made some notes about the tone of each source. Now, two really good words that could be put into your source analysis are the words objective and subjective. Objective means a source that informs us. It can be balanced and is going to be factual rather than biased and opinionated. Okay, so if you have a source like that, try and use that word that is an objective source. A subjective source would refer to information that is based on personal opinion. Okay, so again, if you have something that's a diary or a personal letter or anything like that, then it is going to be based on personal opinions, so it's going to be subjective. Okay, so we can use those words as well. So the reliability of the source, how can we trust it? Okay, now obviously the question is asking you how valuable each of those sources are, okay, and we need to work that out. And what I say to my students are to use the plus and minuses. So the plus would signal in your little notes what the strengths and the value are of each source, and the minus would signal what are the omissions or the discriminations or things that have been left out that you want to comment upon then. So with regards to the positive, the strengths, the value, this is evidence of anti-Semitic measures within months of the Nazis being in power. It's right there, look at the start of the reign in 1933, okay? So it is a signal that is going to be the start of this discrimination. They are economically excluding Jews. In the same month, they were dismissed from the civil service. In the September, they were prevented from inheriting land. So all of this is context of that will tie into the source because it's from the time, okay, of the time. Public justification of the treatment of Jews. Its value is really showing us how racial policy at this point was starting to be implemented in quite a controlled fashion. The minus point, the limitations of this source, is that it was sympathetic to the Nazi racial policy, of course, okay? It's public justification of methods that they're currently using and that they will go on to use as well. So pluses and minuses with regards to source B. The strengths are showing that the treatment of the Jews are now more extreme by 1938, and it's a major turning point due to the von Rath murder in Paris, and it's showing that the German people are now encouraged to actually come out, take part in this collective condemnation of the Jews. So it's a change from the earlier haphazard practices, and the Nazis are now in a more secure position economically and politically. So they are sort of ramping it up really with their persecution of the Jews. The limitations, the biases and weaknesses or omissions, we would treat with caution because it is an American report, of course. With regards to source C, if we look at the context first of this one, okay, it is repeating what Hitler's prophecy was from 1939, you know, regarding the extermination of the Jews. So this is actually justification of actions that have been or maybe will be taken. And it's showing there's a real struggle for, you know, the racial survival for the Nazis. Obviously, the Wannsee Conference, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising has already taken place. So Himmler is sort of putting across the view, you know, it's the moral right to exterminate Jews. The strengths of the source, you know, full implications of the anti-Semitism that was obviously apparent during the war. It reveals their extremely radical thinking and the thinking that there was a Jewish Bolshevik trait threat to all Germans. Obviously, the limitations of this, it's a Nazi viewpoint, it's obviously sharing the blame without accepting the guilt, and it is extremely biased. So you then need to say an overall judgment, a mini judgment on each source and an overall judgment on how valuable the sources are to the question that it is asking you in your exam paper. Now, when you're evaluating sources, that is your checklist again there, okay? Again, remember what I said at the very beginning and from what the examiner said, they do not want a static checklist that you are sort of ticking off in order. They want to see that these things are covered, but they want to see that you're doing it in a very free way with your writing, okay? And don't forget objective and subjective if they apply to the sources that you receive. Now, again, I put the mark scheme for that 2019 paper in here as well, and I'm not going to spend time going through it, but we've got the source A overview and the source B from the exam board and the source C. So again, you could have a look and see if you were going to mention something else, whether it is actually mentioned in that mark scheme. Now, when you have marking, obviously you are doing papers and past paper questions for your lecturers or your teachers. Very often they will use these abbreviations and these annotations, okay? So if you have S's, they're looking at the strengths of the sources, or you have mentioned them, which is obviously a good thing. An L is you've mentioned the limitations of the sources. At would be that you've talked about the attribution in the usefulness of the source, which is great. That your SE is that you have a valid source evaluation. CXT means that you've discussed the context, the things that are happening surrounding the sources. V, you have looked at the value and you've discussed the value of the sources to historians. OM is that you might have a list of general omissions of coverage, and UCN is that you've got narrative events, so you don't want too much of UCN on your papers. Now, you've obviously made your notes around your sources, and now you need to write up your notes. So I've got some intro, main and conclusion sentences here that you could use for your different sections. Obviously, you can amend them and add to them as you so wish. So in your introduction, you need to focus on the word value, okay, and the key concept theme that is in your question. So possible introduction sentences could be the sources, whilst they all have their uses and are valuable to the issue of, and then bring in that question that you're being asked, okay? So you're showing the examiner right from the off that you are directing your answer on what they want from you. You could want to say they do vary due to omissions or biases, which affects their overall value. Another sentence could be that the sources are only small extracts. They're not comprehensive to the topic of, and obviously you bring in that key concept theme that's in your question singly. However, each hold their own individual values, or they have different opinions on, okay, and you could develop that a bit further. With regard to your main body, it is absolutely essential that for each source, at least once, that you have written something along the lines of the source is of value to an historian studying, obviously use the key issue there that you have got, and back it up with why it is of value. You could go on and develop your answer by saying source A is of value because it suggests, it was written by, then this further adds to its value because. Source B is relatively valuable to an historian studying whatever it is because, however, it fails to mention and obviously be able to add additional information onto your context there. Or maybe even whilst valuable, source C does need to be treated with caution because, and obviously continue that. Now, even if you struggle to understand the sources, a decent comment on which gives a reason why the sources of value to an historian studying whatever will get you up to potentially 20 out of 30 in that mark scheme. So all of the sources they give you will have a value, and give a mini judgment on each source as you go through. So there's some more extra sentences here that you could use, some contextual ones as sentence starters, okay? There's some value ones in the middle and there's some limitation ones on the end. Again, when you've got the presentation, pause this, have a look, think about which ones you would perhaps want to remember and use in the future when you're doing your source write-ups, okay? They're all really, really good. So remember, all that highlighting, all the notes that you made, you need to put that into your answers, okay? As well as the other things on your checklist. But remember always to tie it back to why that source is of value. Now your conclusion, okay, again, I've got a selection of different things here, okay, but you need to comment on the collective value of the sources, okay? So something like collectively the sources are of value to an historian studying, or in conclusion, the sources are very valuable to an historian studying, or the three sources do provide use and are of value. Now, obviously, you don't need to learn and remember all of these, okay? You just need to think of one and think, yes, this is the way I'm going to do it, okay? And then work it around the question that they ask in this summer's exam. You might want to develop more of a conclusion at the end, so that some of these might be of use to you. So they have different opinions of, obviously you're talking about the sources, but when they're used together, they are of greater value. However, each have their respective omissions or biases. You could mention that they're small extracts, so they're not comprehensive to the topic singly, but together they provide insight into whatever, which when used together provides a balanced overview. That's a good way of saying that the sources singly aren't as good as when you put them all together, because you get a better picture. So reiterate, the sources, whilst they all have their uses, they do vary in value, okay, because they will do, because they'll all come from different places. But when you put them all together, it's obviously more value. Now then, just a sort of sum up really of the top tips that I've mentioned. So absolutely essential that for each source, at least once you write the sources of value to an historian studying, whatever you're studying, whatever's in that question. Even if you struggle to understand the source, remember you need to put down its value, okay? And that can potentially get you 20 to 30. Make sure you do a conclusion on the collective value. And all of the sources will have a value. They will not provide you with useless sources. So you just need to figure out what the value of that source is. So hopefully you've done all these things that are in the stars there. Okay, if you have followed the checklist and you've covered everything, then you know you've got a very strong source analysis answer to put into either your teachers or to that examiner. Now, general do's and don'ts, as the examiner said right at the very start, don't assess the source from a formula and trawl through it. You need to, yes, cover everything, but don't do it in a static way. You have to comment on more than just the content and the attributions. Do not copy long sections of the source out. There's no need for it. There's also no need for long historical introductions or for irrelevant background material. You don't need to rank the sources. And don't forget to address the question. So what could be the next steps for you students who are studying Unit 4, Question 1? So my advice to you is, first of all, to ensure you understand your specification for your particular depth study and know every key issue that is mentioned in it. I've put the link there again for the specifications, so you can go in and make sure that you know what you should remember and what you need to know in depth for this exam in the summer. But also remember, you've probably not finished the course yet, so there probably will be elements of it that you haven't covered yet, but you should have by the time of the exam. The third thing I would suggest is that you practice the techniques given today and the techniques you've already got from year 12 and from what your teachers and lecturers have given you, and that you use those to evaluate, depth study sources from past paper questions and from examples that may be given to you from teachers and lecturers. I've put the link in there for the past paper questions as well, so you can go back. And obviously I've showed you that you can still use those past paper questions whilst those little changes have happened to the layout and the stem of the question for you this year. And obviously those changes were in place for last year if you want to have a good look at the papers from last year. The last thing I think you should be doing is obviously timing yourself, okay? Timing yourself, making your notes, doing your highlighting, doing your underlining, picking out the things that you know you're going to comment upon in your source analysis. So as a general guide, we say 10 to 15 minutes to evaluate and to make your notes, and then round about 45 minutes to do that write-up. So first session, okay, on source skills done. What I'll be doing next week, in next week's session, I'm going to be looking at the essay skills, question 2 and 3. And then, as I said at the start, we've got information from Andrew Morell on the breadth study going on for the next 2 sessions, following on from mine next week.